Blackett Strait, off the coast of Bangura in the Solomon Islands. August 6, 1943. Just after 10 at night. 6 American boats sit dead in the water in total darkness. Engines throttled down to a whisper. No running lights. No radio chatter. Just the slow rock of swells against hulls made of quarter-inch plywood, hulls so thin that a single sustained burst from a Japanese destroyer's deck gun could snap one clean in half. Somewhere out in that black water, for Japanese destroyers are moving on schedule. The same schedule they have kept for almost a year. The Tokyo Express, the resupply run that has fed and reinforced Japanese garrisons across the Solomons almost untouched, night after night, because nothing the Allies have thrown at it so far has been able to stop it for long. These destroyers carry 5-inch guns. Guns that can hit a target from a distance these 6 wooden boats cannot even see. Steel hulls. Trained crews. A ship built, from the keel up, to win exactly this kind of fight. On paper, this is not a battle. This is 6 plywood speedboats about to be run over by a line of steel. And here is the detail that should not be true. These 6 boats are called torpedo boats. Not gunboats. Not raiders. Torpedo boats. That is their name. That is their entire design. For tubes, each one built around a single purpose, putting a torpedo into something much bigger than themselves. Tonight, most of these boats are not carrying torpedoes at all. By the time the sun comes up over Bangura, 3 of those 4 Japanese destroyers will be gone. Sunk in the same strait they had crossed dozens of times before, almost daring anyone to stop them. And the boats that helped make that happen were not winning because their torpedoes finally worked. They were winning because, for many of them, the torpedo tubes had already been physically removed. This is not a story about a weapon getting better. It is a story about the United States Navy quietly admitting, in the middle of a war, that its signature weapon for these boats simply did not work, and then doing something institutions rarely do under pressure. Letting the men actually fighting the war rebuild the boat, and the doctrine around it, from the ground up. So the real question here is not how 6 plywood boats beat for destroyers. It is something stranger. Why did a torpedo boat with no torpedoes end up more dangerous to the Japanese Navy than one that still had them? And what does that say about how the entire Pacific War at sea was actually being fought, underneath the version everyone already knows? To answer that, you have to go back further than Blackett Strait. Back to where the whole idea of the PT boat came from in the first place, and how far that idea was about to drift from what it was built for. The concept of the motor torpedo boat was not American. It was European, and it came with a track record that made the idea feel proven before the United States ever built one. British coastal forces had used small torpedo craft in the First World War. So had the Italians, whose Motoscafo Armato Siluranti boats, small, fast, torpedo-armed, managed something that seemed almost impossible for their size. In 1918, one of them sank the Austro-Hungarian battleship Szent István, a fully armored capital ship, using nothing but speed, darkness, and a single well-placed torpedo. That single engagement became the founding legend of the small torpedo boat. Proof that size did not have to determine outcome, if you had the right weapon and the right moment. American shipbuilders, Elko in New Jersey, Higgins in New Orleans, followed that blueprint almost exactly 2 decades later. The boats that came out of their yards ran 77 to 80 feet long. Twin or triple Packard for M-2500 gasoline engines, producing more than 4,000 horsepower combined. Nominal top speeds near 40 knots, though real-world conditions in the Pacific rarely let a boat hold that for long. And for 21-inch Mark 8 torpedo tubes, because in the doctrine these boats were built around, the torpedo was not one option among several. The torpedo was the entire reason the boat existed. Inside the Navy, and especially among the Japanese destroyer captains who had already tangled with American PT squadrons early in the Solomons campaign, the assumption on both sides was the same. Take away the torpedo, and you take away the threat. A boat built and armed around a single weapon system would be finished the moment that weapon system failed to deliver. Both sides were about to be proven partly right and completely wrong in the same breath. This assumption ran so deep that it shaped how the Navy trained its crews before they ever reached the Pacific. At the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron's training center in Melville, Rhode Island, young officers and enlisted men spent months drilling on torpedo runs against stationary target hulls in calm, controlled water, practicing the exact skill set the boat's entire design assumed would decide every engagement. Nobody training at Melville in 1941 was being prepared for a fight where the torpedo simply did not matter. That gap between what a peacetime evaluation rewarded and what a warm, shallow, current-swept strait in the South Pacific actually demanded is where this entire story begins. Because the torpedo was already failing. Quietly. Repeatedly. Long before anyone in Washington or at Pearl Harbor was willing to say so out loud. The Mark 8 torpedo carried by PT boats traced its design back to the 1910s. By 1942, and well into 1943, it was, in practical combat terms, a broken weapon. It ran shallower than it was set to run. It wandered off course in ways crews could not predict or correct for. And in engagement after engagement, even when it struck exactly where it was aimed, it simply did not go off. Squadron after action reports coming out of Guadalcanal in late 1942 described the same pattern over and over, almost word for word. A torpedo run against a slow-moving Japanese destroyer or transport. A visible wake tracking dead center toward the hull. Sometimes even an audible thump on impact. And then nothing. No flame. No secondary explosion. No sinking. Just a Japanese ship sailing on, undamaged, while the crew that fired the torpedo watched their one shot at that target disappear into the dark. This was not an isolated PT boat problem. It was the same family of exploder failure that would later become infamous in the Navy's submarine force, with the Mark 14 torpedo, a scandal that took the Bureau of Ordnance far too long to acknowledge, and even longer to properly fix. Same flawed magnetic and contact exploder logic. Same pattern of sailors risking their boats and their lives to deliver a hit that, mechanically, never had much chance of doing what it was supposed to do. Lieutenant Commander John Bulkley understood this earlier than almost anyone. Bulkley had commanded PT boats in the Philippines in 1942, and had personally evacuated General Douglas MacArthur from Corregidor aboard PT-41 during the desperate retreat from the islands. He returned to the United States in the middle of 1942 to lecture the next wave of PT crews before they shipped out to the Pacific. His message to them was blunt, and it cut directly against everything those boats had been built to believe about themselves. You cannot trust the torpedo as the sole tool of the trade. That single sentence, repeated to trainee after trainee at a base most of them had never heard of before the war, is the hidden lever this entire story turns on. Because once squadron commanders out in the Solomons accepted that the torpedo could not be trusted, they were left holding a much harder question. If a torpedo boat's own torpedo does not reliably work, what, exactly, is the boat actually for? The answer they arrived at was not handed down from a doctrine manual in Washington. It was built the hard way, through trial, error, and boats that did not come back. The answer was gunnery. Not long-range gunnery. These boats had no chance of winning a gunnery duel at range against a destroyer's 5-inch battery. Close-range, high-volume gunnery. The kind that only works if the platform delivering it is small enough and fast enough to get inside a destroyer's minimum gun depression, and inside the reaction time of Japanese lookouts, before an alarm can even be raised. Through 1943, squadrons operating out of Rendova, and later out of Vella La Vella, began physically stripping torpedo tubes off some of their boats. Not because torpedoes were formally banned or the doctrine was officially rewritten from above. Because out in the field, crews had worked out that those tubes were dead weight, throwing unreliable fish that, more often than not, achieved nothing except giving away the boat's position. In place of the tubes went heavier and heavier gun mounts. A 37 or 40 mm Bofors cannon aft. Twin 50 caliber machine gun turrets amidships. Eventually, 20 mm Oerlikon cannons forward as well. A fully worked-up PT boat by late 1943 could throw out something in the range of 900 rounds a minute of mixed-caliber fire, from a hull that drew barely 4 feet of water, capable of turning inside the radius of any Japanese destroyer afloat, and closing to under 500 yards before that destroyer's main battery could even depress low enough to bear on it. On a specification sheet drawn up by a peacetime naval architect, this looks like a downgrade almost too strange to justify. A torpedo boat abandoning its own namesake weapon in favor of what amounted to a heavily armed speedboat. Out on the water, at night, in the narrow, reef-strewn channels of the Central Solomons, it meant something else entirely. Critics inside the Navy, and certainly the officers who had trained these same crews on torpedo doctrine only a year earlier, were not universally comfortable with what was happening to their boats. A vessel stripped of its namesake weapon and rebuilt around close-range gunnery was, by the standards those officers had been taught, no longer really a torpedo boat at all. It was something closer to an improvised gunboat wearing a torpedo boat's hull. That distinction mattered less to the crews actually fighting the Tokyo Express than it did to anyone reviewing the change from a desk thousands of miles away. Here is where the story stops being about hardware specifications and starts being about a target nobody back home was thinking about at all. Because Japanese destroyers were never the only thing running the Tokyo Express through these straits. Most nights, the real traffic was barges. Landing craft. Low, slow, soft-skinned transports loaded with troops, ammunition, and rice, threading through the same shallow, reef-choked water that Japanese destroyers themselves often avoided. A torpedo, even a working one, was almost useless against these targets. Many of them drew so little water that a torpedo could not arm itself properly before passing harmlessly underneath the hull. A sustained burst of 50 caliber fire, raked along a barge's waterline at close range, could open the hull and swamp the vessel in under a minute, faster than any torpedo, reliable or not, could ever have managed against the same target. That is the exact moment the so-called downgrade quietly becomes an upgrade. The gun-heavy PT boat was never just a fallback plan for nights when the torpedoes failed against big, dramatic targets. It turned out to be the far better weapon for what these boats actually spent most of their nights doing, strangling the unglamorous, unarmored supply traffic that kept Japanese garrisons alive. And once that realization set in, crews started making decisions no engineer back in Newport, Rhode Island had ever anticipated. The economics behind the shift mattered just as much as the tactics, and squadron commanders understood the arithmetic clearly, even if nobody wrote it into an official doctrine paper at the time. A single Mark 8 torpedo cost the Navy roughly $10,000 wartime dollars to build and issue. It took a trained crew nearly a full minute to set, aim, and fire under combat conditions. And by the estimate squadron reports were circulating at the time, figures worth treating as the honest, if rough, assessment of the men actually firing them, rather than a laboratory-certified statistic, its failure rate in the field ran above 1 in 5. A belt of 50 caliber ammunition, by comparison, was cheap. It reloaded in seconds instead of minutes. And it was forgiving of the wild, pitching firing platform. A PT boat became the instant it opened up its engines above 30 knots in open water, something a precisely aimed torpedo run never tolerated well. Crews and squadron mechanics adapted around this new math wherever they could. They pulled redundant torpedo tubes entirely. They lightened ammunition lockers to compensate for the added weight of heavier gun mounts. In some documented cases, they even stripped cockpit armor plating that had proven essentially useless against anything larger than small arms fire, trading that dead protective weight for more belted ammunition instead, a decision that tells you exactly how confident these crews had become in a fight built around speed, coordination, and volume of fire rather than armor or a single decisive torpedo strike. None of this required a new hull design, a new engine, a metallurgical breakthrough. It required something far rarer inside a large, cautious wartime bureaucracy admitting that the boat's signature weapon had failed, and then having the discipline to let the men in the field rebuild an entire fighting doctrine around that admission instead of pretending the problem would eventually go away on its own. Commanders like John Bulkeley and Robert Kelly, who by this point in the campaign had become the loudest advocates for the gun-heavy approach, were not doing this out of any disrespect for the torpedo boat concept itself. They understood something more precise than that. The original promise of the motor torpedo boat, a cheap, expendable platform punching far above its own weight class, could still be fulfilled. It simply had to be fulfilled by an entirely different weapons mix than the one written into the boat's original design brief back in a shipyard in New Jersey or New Orleans, years before anyone involved had seen a single night in the Solomons. And that rebuilding produced a version of the PT boat that Japanese destroyer captains on the other side of these engagements simply had not trained for, and had no time to adjust to. Squadrons operating out of Lamari Island near Rendover, through the second half of 1943, refined the emerging tactic into something crews started calling the picket line. Boats would spread out a mile or two apart across the width of a strait, running completely dark, using the newly issued SO surface search radar to detect Japanese hulls at ranges up to 15 miles, in conditions where a human lookout, straining against total darkness and rain squalls, would have seen absolutely nothing until the range had already closed to almost nothing. When a radar contact was confirmed and identified, boats would converge from multiple bearings simultaneously, hitting a single target from 2 or 3 directions within seconds of each other. The tactical logic behind this was almost mathematically simple. No single Japanese gun crew, however well trained, could track and engage more than one fast-moving attacker at a time in total darkness. This is no longer a story about one boat, one torpedo, one moment of luck. This is a story about turning a documented weapons failure into the design foundation for an entirely different kind of naval weapon system, coordinated, radar-directed, multi-boat night ambush, built around guns instead of torpedoes. But this doctrine did not arrive without cost, and the story is incomplete, maybe even dishonest, if that cost gets skipped over. On August 2, 1943, for days before the battle, this story opened with Lieutenant John F. Kennedy's boat, PT-109, was patrolling this same stretch of water, still executing the older, torpedo-centered doctrine the fleet was already in the process of abandoning. In the darkness, the Japanese destroyer Amagiri rammed PT-109, splitting the plywood hull almost instantly in half. Kennedy and most of his crew survived, through a combination of endurance and improvisation that has since become its own well-known story. But inside the squadrons, the loss of PT-109 became something more specific than a famous survival story. It became a case study, cited by commanders arguing, with PT-109 as their evidence, that a single boat hunting alone in the dark with torpedoes as its primary weapon was no longer a viable way to fight in these waters. The doctrine that nearly killed Kennedy's crew was already, in that same month, being written out of the fleet's playbook. What followed was not a single lucky ambush. It was a pattern, repeating across the Solomons through the second half of 1943, that began strangling an entire Japanese supply line one engagement at a time. Weeks before Blackett Strait, at the Battle of Kula Gulf on the night of July 5 and 6, 1943, PT boats operating independently in the strait sank or crippled multiple landing barges carrying elements of the Japanese 2nd and 6th Divisions, bound for reinforcement duty on Bangura. By late 1943, Japan had begun shifting a significant share of its resupply effort toward submarine transport instead, a method that was far more expensive to operate, and carried a fraction of the cargo capacity of a standard destroyer or barge run. Squadron commanders at the time treated that shift as exactly what it looked like, a direct, if unspoken, admission from Japanese Naval Command that surface resupply through these PT-infested straits had become unsustainable. Japanese officers captured and interrogated later in the campaign reportedly described these boats, sometimes translated as the Devil boats, as more disruptive to their resupply schedule than almost anything the Allies had thrown at them short of dedicated Allied air power. The reason given was almost always the same. These small, fast, gun-heavy boats could operate in the shallow, reef-choked straits that Japanese destroyers and larger warships deliberately avoided, which meant there was no safe water left for a resupply run to hide in. By early 1944, near Bougainville, an element of just 4 PT boats was recorded destroying an entire barge convoy of 6 to 8 vessels in under 15 minutes of sustained, close-range fire. American losses in that engagement were limited to hull punctures and wounded crew, with no boats lost outright, a casualty ratio that would have been almost unthinkable a year earlier, when squadrons were still built around torpedo runs against targets that, in many cases, drew too little water for a torpedo to arm properly in the first place. What had started as a local, improvised fix for a broken weapon had become, within a little over a year, a strategic bottleneck squeezing an entire Japanese military position in the Central Solomons. The pattern held even as the campaign moved beyond the Solomons into 1944. Ensign candidate reports from squadrons operating near Bougainville describe the same coordinated approach repeating itself engagement after engagement, boats closing from multiple bearings, radar picking up contacts long before any lookout could, and Japanese barge crews finding no stretch of shallow water left where a PT boat could not follow them. Japanese commanders had built their entire resupply strategy around using terrain no destroyer could safely enter. That terrain had just stopped being safe for anyone. Which brings the story back, finally, to Blackett Strait, and to what actually happened there on the night of August 6 and 7, 1943. 6 PT boats, working alongside a larger American destroyer force under Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, intercepted the Tokyo Express run sent to reinforce Kolombangara. The Japanese force, under Captain Kaju Sugiura, lost 3 destroyers that night, the Hagakes, the Arashi, and the Kawakaze, to a combination of American destroyer gunfire and torpedo work, with the PT boats screening the main action and finishing off damaged vessels and troop-laden barges in the shallow water that the larger American destroyers could not safely enter. This is the full weight of the contradiction this story opened with. The boats built, named, and originally armed around the Torpedo won this engagement largely without relying on it. Not because someone in a laboratory finally fixed the Mark 8. Because the United States Navy allowed its own established doctrine to be rewritten, from the bottom up, by the men who had personally watched that torpedo fail night after night in the dark, and who refused to keep pretending the failure did not exist. None of what happened at Blackett Strait, or at Kula Gulf, or near Bougainville, required a new hull design, a new engine, or a technological breakthrough of any kind. It required something considerably rarer inside a large, cautious military institution operating under the pressure of a global war, the willingness to admit that a flagship weapon system had failed, and the discipline to let junior officers rebuild an entire fighting doctrine around that admitted failure, instead of quietly protecting the original design on paper while men kept dying to prove it did not work. The Mark 8 torpedo itself was never fully fixed during the war. It was still producing isolated failures well into 1944. But by that point, the failure barely mattered anymore, because the boats carrying it had already become something functionally different from what they were designed to be, floating ambush gun platforms that could inflict more sustained damage on Japan's supply lines than the weapon they were officially named for had ever managed to deliver. By the time the Solomons campaign wound down in early 1944, PT boats had sunk or damaged an estimated hundreds of small craft, barges, and several destroyers across the theater. More importantly, they had forced Japanese planners into a resupply system that was slower, more expensive, and structurally incapable of keeping garrisons across the Central Solomons properly fed, reinforced, and supplied, a strategic consequence that traced back, in a straight line, to a handful of squadron commanders deciding to stop trusting a torpedo that kept failing them. It is worth being precise about what this story is not. It is not a story about American ingenuity magically overcoming bad equipment through sheer will. It is a story about a specific, documentable decision made under fire, without waiting for approval from Washington, to treat a failed weapon as a fact to be designed around rather than a defect to be quietly tolerated. That distinction is the entire difference between a squadron that keeps losing boats to a torpedo that does not work, and a squadron that starts winning with the same hulls, the same crews, and almost none of the weapon they were originally sent out to fight with. The torpedo boats that mattered most in the Solomon's campaign were, by the end, barely torpedo boats at all. They won this fight by becoming something their own name never described, built by men who were never given permission from above to change the design, and who changed it anyway because the alternative was watching more boats and more crews disappear into a strait for the sake of a weapon that had already proven, over and over, that it could not be trusted. The most dangerous moment for any military doctrine is rarely the moment its weapon fails. It is the moment after that, when the people responsible for it have to decide whether to admit the failure out loud, or keep sending men out with a weapon everyone already quietly knows does not work.